In front of every guest at a medieval feast sat a thick slab of stale, dark bread. It sat straight on the bare table, no plate beneath it, because the bread was the plate. And by the end of the meal, what each guest did with that slab would tell everyone in the hall exactly where they ranked. Picture the place that mattered most. The autumn of 1465, the great hall of Cawood Castle in Yorkshire, the enthronement feast of George Neville as Archbishop of York. The records of that feast still survive, and they read like the inventory of a small kingdom. More than 100 oxen, 1,000 sheep, wheat counted by the hundreds of quarters, and swans, herons, and pike carried in by the dozen. And in front of every guest in that hall, before a single hot dish arrived, that same humble slab of bread. It was called a trencher. Today we are going to show you what it actually was. A single piece of dining technology that did 4 separate jobs at once, in a society that had no plumbing, no dishwashing, and no welfare office. And by the end you will know which guests ate their bread, which refused it, and why that choice exposed the rank of everyone in the room. Strip away the word and the mystique, and a trencher is simple. It was a thick piece of bread, usually stale, used as an edible plate. The word itself tells you how it was made. Trencher comes from the old French trancher, meaning to cut or to slice. The same root gives us the word trench, a cut in the earth. A trencher was a slab sliced from a larger loaf. A typical trencher was about the size of a modern paperback, roughly 6 inches across, an inch or so thick, squared off at the edges or left as a rough rectangle. It went directly on the bare table in front of each diner, and onto that bread went the meal. Roasted meat, fish, anything with sauce or juice. And here is where the modern assumption falls apart. The trencher was not a sad substitute used because medieval people had not gotten around to inventing plates. They had bowls. They had cups. The wealthy owned gold and silver vessels worth more than a farmhouse. The trencher sat on the table alongside all of it, on purpose, because it did something a metal plate could not. It absorbed. A roast on a silver platter sits in a cooling puddle of its own grease and blood. A roast on a trencher sits on a sponge. The bread drank the juices. It pulled the fat, the sauce, and the blood down into itself, and kept the table from turning into a cold, greasy mess. The trencher was a working surface and an absorption system in a single object, but for the bread to do that job, it had to be built for it, and medieval bakers engineered it with a level of care that sounds at first like a mistake. At a medieval feast, the bread you ate off of was served deliberately stale, days old. That staleness was the entire point. To understand why, start with the bread itself. In a wealthy medieval household, the bread you ate and the bread you ate off of were not the same loaf. The fine white bread, the manchet, went to the lord and his high guests. Soft, pale, milled from the most heavily sifted flour. But trenchers were cut from a coarser, darker, denser loaf, often a maslin loaf, baked from a mix of wheat and rye, or from rye alone. That density was deliberate too. A light, airy loaf would collapse the instant a wet roast landed on it. Trencher bread was engineered to be structural. It had to hold weight, resist juice for the length of a meal, and still cut cleanly under a knife. And then it was aged. Trencher loaves were baked, then deliberately set aside, commonly around 4 days, before anyone cut into them. Think about why. Fresh bread is soft and damp. It compresses and soaks through in minutes. Stale bread is firm, dry, and rigid. A 4-day-old loaf could be sliced into clean, sturdy slabs that behaved almost like a wooden board. Get that wrong, serve a trencher too fresh, and a guest's entire dinner ended up in his lap. The staling turns soft bread into a tool. None of this was folk habit passed around by accident. It was written down. Medieval courtesy books, The manuals that trained the servants of great households gave precise instruction on trenchers. In England, John Russell's Boke of Nurture from the 15th century told the pantler exactly how to handle them, how to cut and trim them, how to stack and present them before the meal. There was an entire office of the household devoted to bread and its cutting, the pantler, with the carver working beside him. Preparing trenchers correctly was a trained, inspected skill. This system worked so well it ran almost unchanged for centuries. But the trencher was never only a piece of bread. Watch one actually do its job, because the way a medieval meal used them is stranger than it sounds. Picture the meal in motion. There are no forks on this table. In 15th century England, the table fork was still a foreign curiosity, something a few Italians used and most diners found faintly ridiculous. You ate with a knife, a spoon, and your hands. Food came to the table in shared dishes, set down for groups of diners to take from. You drew your portion out of the communal dish and laid it on your trencher. And in that moment the bread became something more than a plate. It became your territory, your station, the one square of the table that was yours. While you ate, the trencher worked. Every sauce, every drop of fat, every bit of juice ran off the meat and into the bread instead of across the table. A medieval feast could run for hours and many courses. Without the trencher, the surface in front of each guest would have been an unusable mess before the first course was even cleared. The table itself was often just a board laid across trestles. It is where we still get the phrase to set the board. The trencher protected that surface. At a grand feast, trenchers were swapped between courses. A servant cleared the soaked, sagging bread and laid down a fresh slab for the next round of dishes. At a humbler table, you got one trencher and it lasted the whole meal, slowly darkening and softening as it filled with everything you had eaten. And that is the trencher at the end of the night. It started as dry, pale, structural bread. Now it is saturated, stained dark with juices, heavy, soft, holding the concentrated fat and flavour of the entire meal. By the last course, it has quietly become the richest piece of food on the table, which raises the obvious question, the one this whole video has been building toward. Who actually ate it? Because what happened to that soaked slab of bread was not left to chance. It was one of the most precise social signals in the medieval hall. To understand what the trencher revealed, look at where you were sitting. A great hall was ranked space. The lord sat at the high table, often raised up on a dais. Down the length of the hall, on benches, sat everyone else, in descending order of importance. The marker was the salt. A large ornate salt cellar stood on the high table. To sit between the salt and the lord was to sit above the salt, among the honoured. To sit beyond it was to sit below the salt. We still use that phrase today for someone of lower standing. The room was a map of status, and everyone in it could read the map. Now watch the trenchers. At the high table, a lord or an honoured guest did not eat his trencher. The soaked bread, easily the best food in front of him, was beneath him. To eat the thing your meat had merely rested on was to behave like someone who needed it. Status meant you could leave it. Further down the hall, that same soaked trencher was a genuine part of the meal. Servants, lower guests, and poorer diners ate their trenchers. For them the bread was not a status test. It was dinner, and a good one, soaked through with meat fat they would otherwise rarely taste. But the used trenchers from the high table did not go to waste, and they did not just go to the floor. In a well-run household they were collected into a vessel called the alms dish, and the household kept an officer whose entire job was this: the almoner, a real salaried position in royal and noble households. The almoner moved through the hall after the feast, gathered the leftover food, the used trenchers above all, and carried it out to the poor who waited at the gate. Look at what that means. The single most nutritious item on that table, bread enriched with fat, with iron, with the concentrated drippings of 100 roasted oxen, travelled straight down the social ladder. The people with the most refused it. The people with the least received it. The trencher did not just hold the meal, it sorted it. There is one more destination for a trencher, and you have probably guessed it. The dogs. Hunting dogs were a normal presence in a medieval hall, and the scraps, bones and bread the almoner did not take went to them. Add it all up, and you get something a modern kitchen simply does not have. A dining system with almost no waste built into it. The plate was bread. When the meal ended, the plate was eaten by a lower diner, carried to the poor, or given to the animals. Nothing was scraped into a bin. Nothing was washed. The plate just disappeared back into the food chain. And this next part changes how you see your own kitchen. Think about what a plate costs you. You own a separate object whose only purpose is to hold food. You paid for it, you store it, and after every meal you clean it with hot water, energy and soap. Now look at the trencher again. There was no dish to buy, nothing to store, nothing to wash, and no scraps to bin. The medieval hall solved, with a piece of stale bread, a problem you still pay for every single day, and the economics ran deeper than convenience. In a medieval household, bread was not a side item. Grain was the single largest part of most food budgets, and people ate it in quantities we would find staggering today. So the trencher was thrift, plain and simple. It took the cheapest, coarsest, most abundant food in the building, the dark rye loaf nobody important wanted to eat, and got a second use out of it before anyone consumed it. One ingredient used 4 times over: a plate, a sponge, a marker of rank, and then food for the poor at the gate. We did not replace the trencher with a better system. We traded a plate that fed the poor for a plate that has to be washed. And unlike almost everything else from the medieval table, this is one piece of the medieval kitchen you can rebuild yourself this week and use exactly the way a 15th century diner did. The method is simple. The only thing it really asks for is patience. Start with the loaf, because a trencher is only as good as the bread it is cut from. Skip the soft, airy, modern sandwich loaf. You want something dense, coarse and tight-grained. Use a wholemeal flour, a rye flour, or a mix of the two, the closest thing you can get to a medieval maslin. Add water, a little salt, and only a modest amount of yeast, or a spoonful of sourdough starter. Keep the rise low. A heavy flat loaf is the goal here, and baking it in a rectangular tin lets you slice clean, even slabs out of it later. Then comes the step that matters most, and it takes no effort at all. You wait. Leave the baked loaf out uncovered for about 4 days. It will harden until you could almost knock on it. That hardness is what turns a loaf into a trencher, a slab strong enough to hold a wet roast without sagging into mush. Now cut it. Slice thick slabs, roughly 6 inches across and about 1 inch deep, and square off the edges with a knife, the way a trained medieval pantler would have. Set one slab on a wooden board in front of each person at the table. That is your plate. And then use it properly. Put your roast, your stew, anything with juice or sauce, straight onto the bread and let it sit there through the whole meal, soaking up everything that runs off the food. By the end, the slab will be dark, heavy, and soft. And then you face the one decision every medieval diner faced: eat it or leave it. Eat the soaked trencher, and you are tasting the exact thing the lords at Cawood refused, and the poor at the gate treasured. It costs almost nothing, and it is the closest you will ever get to sitting at a medieval table. The trencher itself has vanished from our kitchens. but it left fingerprints on the language you speak. Call someone a good trencherman today, and you are calling them a hearty eater, someone who clears the board. The word outlived the object by 400 years. That same root, trancher, to cut, also gave soldiers the trench. Two words that sound unrelated, both born from the idea of slicing. You may also have heard that the phrase upper crust comes from the trencher. The story goes that the top crust of the loaf was the finer part, kept for the Lord, while the bottom became trenches. It is a good story, but the evidence is thin, and most language historians treat it as folklore. We will let you decide what to do with that one. The deeper legacy is not a word at all. Go back to Cawood Castle, to that feast in 1465. The hall is loud, the high table is buried in swan and venison, and the Archbishop of York pushes aside a slab of soaked bread he would never lower himself to eat. Now follow that slab. The almoner lifts it into his basket with all the others. He carries it out, away from the noise and the candlelight, to the castle gate. And there, in the cold, a person with nothing eats bread that has soaked up the drippings of the grandest table in northern England. For them, it is the best meal of the year. That is the trencher. A plate you could eat, a sponge that kept the feast clean, a quiet announcement of every diner's rank, and a direct line from the table of plenty to the hungry at the gate. We did not outgrow the trencher. We just stopped being the kind of society that needed one piece of bread to do all four jobs. And that link, food carried straight from the feast to the starving, did not actually disappear. We rebuilt it later under new names like the soup kitchen and the food bank. The bread is gone, but the idea behind it never left. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe to Medieval Way. Every week we dig into the techniques and everyday objects that kept people alive when the world offered no safety net. Drop a comment and tell us. If you bake your own trencher this week, what did you put on it, and did you eat it at the end or leave it? Until next time, stay curious.